What happens when the ocean becomes unstoppable? On March 11, 2011, Japan found out, and its coastline would never look the same. A magnitude 9.0 earthquake struck offshore. The seabed suddenly shifted beneath the Pacific. Then the tsunami began moving toward land. The first warning was not the wave itself. It was the earthquake that shook entire communities. Minutes later, the ocean followed. Tsunami waves surged over coastal defenses. Some structures were damaged by immense forces. Others were simply overtopped. But why did enormous seawalls fail? Their designs were based on expected tsunami conditions. 2011 exceeded those assumptions. Engineers discovered another hidden problem. Water could attack the structure's foundation. Scouring could remove the material supporting it. So rebuilding could not mean replacing concrete alone. The ground beneath the defenses had to be reconsidered. That changed the engineering from the bottom up. Japan began designing a new generation of seawalls. Some sections would rise as high as 14.7 meters. But the height depended on local conditions. Reconstruction eventually covered about 394 kilometers. That was not one continuous wall. It was a collection of site-specific defenses. First came surveys of the coastline. Engineers studied waves, terrain, soil, and existing infrastructure. Only then could construction begin. Foundations were prepared to carry massive loads. Reinforcement was embedded inside the concrete. The visible barrier rose from this hidden base. But walls alone could not protect every location. Rivers and ports still needed pathways to the sea. Those openings became critical targets. Engineers therefore added movable flood barriers. They could seal waterways during tsunami emergencies. And automation reduced dependence on human response.
That mattered because operators may have only minutes. A gate cannot wait for someone to reach it. Emergency control systems became part of the defense.
Then the engineering moved offshore. Skamaishi Bay already had a remarkable breakwater. Its scale revealed another side of the problem.
Its foundation reached roughly 63 meters underwater. Massive concrete caissons formed the structure. Then the 2011 tsunami arrived.
The breakwater suffered major damage. Several sections were displaced or destroyed. But it still reduced the tsunami's impact. That result raised a difficult question. Can a damaged structure still protect people? Skamaishi suggested that it can. The breakwater altered the incoming wave before landfall. That reduced flooding behind the structure. Even partial performance had value. But rebuilding offshore required extraordinary precision. Caissons had to be transported over deep water, then positioned exactly on prepared foundations. Underwater surveying became essential. Engineers needed accurate knowledge of the seabed. The ocean concealed the foundation they were building on. Skamaishi's breakwater contained two major sections. They measured roughly 990 and 670 meters. A navigation opening connected the bay to the sea. That opening could not simply disappear. Ships still needed access to the harbor. Protection had to coexist with daily life. This became the central idea of reconstruction. Coastal defenses had to protect without isolating communities. Engineering had to work around human needs. Different towns, therefore, received different solutions. Some relied heavily on seawalls. Others needed gates, breakwaters, or raised ground. Coastline became a giant engineering experiment. Every section responded to its own geography. No single blueprint could cover everything, and the earthquake remained part of every calculation. A tsunami defense must first survive seismic shaking. Then it may face the ocean. That creates a dangerous sequence. The ground moves violently beneath the structure. Then water attacks it from above and around. Engineers also had to consider aging and maintenance. Concrete exposed to salt water faces constant environmental stress. Protection does not end when construction ends.
The same is true for automated systems. Gates require power, controls, inspections, and maintenance. A sophisticated defense is useless if neglected.
And there was one limit engineers could not remove. The largest tsunami could still exceed the design. No barrier could guarantee absolute protection. So the objective changed from stopping everything. The goal became reducing damage and delaying inundation. That difference shaped the entire strategy. Every extra minute could change an evacuation. Every reduced wave could protect another building. Every layer could reduce the final impact. That made evacuation part of the engineering system. Walls were not replacements for escape routes. They were another layer before evacuation became necessary. Years of construction transformed the Tohoku coastline. Massive concrete structures replaced many older defenses. The landscape became a visible reminder of 2011. But the project was more than concrete. It required surveys, marine construction, automation, and logistics. Thousands of separate decisions had to connect. Engineers could not safely recreate the 2011 disaster. Instead, they used simulations and physical experiments. Monitoring helped test how defenses behave, because nature refuses to follow one exact script. Wave height, direction, timing, and currents can change. The next event may not resemble the last. That uncertainty explains the layered approach. One system absorbs part of the threat. Another system handles what gets through. Today, massive seawalls stand along rebuilt coastlines. Some reach heights that once seemed unimaginable. But they were never meant to make Japan invincible. Their purpose is far more realistic. Reduce the wave. Delay the flooding. Give people more time to escape. March 11 changed what Japan expected from a seawall. It became less about stopping nature completely and more about giving people another chance.